Welcome to my final project I'd like to call Encabe Julio. This podcast will explore the ongoing efforts to revitalize many of the Mesoamerican indigenous languages, but specifically focusing on Yucatec Maya, or Mayatan. While widely known for the Spanish-speaking mestizo demographics, Mexico's national languages are all indigenous. The varying dialects, communities, and ways of knowing have been eradicated by Spanish conquest during the 16th century until present and contemporary day with the effects. It is important to position Mexico as a colonized nation state and to understand broader concepts of identity, colonization, and the relationship between land and language. The Yucatec Maya, simply known by Mayan speakers as Mayatan, is one of many indigenous languages spoken in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, with Mayan variations in Guatemala and Belize. There are approximately 30 Mayan languages that have survived since pre-colonial times. That's why for this video's sake, I will keep using Yucatec Maya just to ensure that we know which region we are talking about. Despite having 800 speakers across the world, and specifically maybe even closer to the Yucatan Peninsula, Yucatec Maya, like many other indigenous languages, is facing extinction as it survives in an increasingly globalized and world that does not value indigenous languages, but rather colonial languages like English and Spanish. Thus, I really want to spend the next portion of the podcast discussing how indigenous languages like Yucatec Maya have had significant cultural and political history within Mexican Americans, Chicanos of the greater Southwest or Aztlan. Through an exploration of Mayan cultural values, particularly dissecting the phrase in La Quech, which has been both adopted and mostly misappropriated within Chicano identity movements and formations, this podcast aims to advance the question of how do Chicanos reflect on the concept of imperialist nostalgia, wanting culture based on limited history or false history, and how does that limited indigenous sovereignty affect indigenous revitalization. The concept of Aztlan, the mythical homeland of the Chicano, has been seen as racist nativists, claiming an entire land of ancestral homeland when they are nations that are still being stewarded by original peoples. The concept of Aztlan stems back way beyond the 1960s Mexican-American thought, which was a reclamation of indigeneity meant to appreciate, or at least that's what it feels like decades later. Because there is this push to study indigenous languages, thought, activism, but we are all, as Chicanos, just supposed to be good and have a right to understand indigeneity. Here I challenge that not all utility of indigenous idea and thought has been used in positive effects. I do have to position myself as somebody who comes from a generation of indigeneity. I've been told to ask my grandma about her history, and she has been referred to as like an Indian by my grandpa. He would always tell me, your grandma's an Indian, and she would tell me about her grandpa, who she knew was an Indian, and how he has a spiritual and herbalistic way about him, which she carries with her today. So I really want to ground this work a bit more on the idea of indigeneity. I have studied Mayan for two languages, Yucatec Maya for 2 years now, and have grown a profound appreciation for linguistics, indigenous language revitalization through virtual learning and histories of Mexico. Focusing on the Red Nation, I explored this concept of land-language connection, which means that the language of the people that are stewards to the land are inseparable from culture and linguistic preservation. Meaning, if you are not on the land of your ancestry or ancestry of the individuals you are learning from, then automatically you are displaced or disconnected from that land and language. This is very important when thinking of two things: virtual learning in the context of indigenous language revitalization and in the context of studying a language online at home, and that does not have the same effect as being on the land and understanding how the language interacts with the land. Further, understanding how Chicano culture has been influenced by language that is not from their homeland or manifested homelands, and how they utilize indigenous cultures in a means for political and social survival. Thus, this podcast will understand how land-centric approaches, virtual learning, and land-language connections all affect the Chicanx indigeneity that is still facing and plaguing many communities who do not understand that Chicanos can be indigenous, but also understanding that indigeneity does not just simply come by studying it. Much like most of Latin America, the Yucatan Peninsula was colonized by Spanish crown in the 16th century, which was a result in systemic attempts to suppress indigenous languages and values and enforce Spanish colonialism. The Spanish colonizers positioned Spanish as a language of power, education, upward mobility, while Maya and other indigenous languages were marginalized and seen as less than. Missionary education brought alphabetic writing to the Maya, but primarily as a tool for religious conversation. Further, one of the only documented Mayan languages is the Bible, meaning that they translated the Spanish, Latin, and other Bibles into the Mayan language. The erasure of indigenous voices took all-time high in an infamous burning of Maya codices by the Spanish, which has been seen and reflected in many of indigenous communities in contemporary Latin America. This history of burning art and knowledge, which was already limited, sources being written down because indigenous communities usually use oral histories to pass on knowledge. The history of the Mayan is one of the most devastating acts of cultural erasure, eliminating not just books, but entire knowledge systems and people, which embed indigenous language and writing into a larger context. Focusing back on a course concept on land and how linguistic colonization can parallel territorial colonization, drawing from Marinos Jimenez's analysis of indigenous women resistance in Oaxaca, we can understand how free market extractive activities, whether mining in Oaxaca or invasive tourism seen in contemporary Yucatan, there are operationalized through everyday violent practices that are perpetuated on human and non-human bodies. As Maya people lost control of their lands, their language, which also contains sophisticated environmental knowledge, speaking Maya is simply not just understanding who a person is speaking about, but it's understanding where a person is speaking from, and that is truly not encapsulated in many of the translations or even in Spanish or English, which are other native tongues. Understanding that there was an agricultural technique to speaking Maya, a spiritual connection specific to place. These were all diminished by the Spanish crown. Secondly, understanding contemporary challenges and globalization of the Yucatan Peninsula. Yucatec Maya faces many challenges in the era of modernity, economic pressures, tourism, like previously mentioned, and social media saturation have created colonial pushes where Spanish and English dominate. Many Maya parents, hoping to give their children economic advantages, have chosen to raise them speaking Spanish rather than Maya. Schools in Latin America have historically emphasized Spanish language education, often punishing children for speaking indigenous languages, a practice that has been reported throughout many indigenous communities nationwide and worldwide. This can be seen kind of similar to how Chicanos faced oppression during the late civil rights movement, or in their whole time in the United States for speaking Spanish. We can really draw parallels to how indigenous communities were forced to speak Spanish, and how The Mayan people are colonized in the same way that Chicanos are, but they're not. They have a new way of understanding Spanish that a Pocho Chicano would not understand what that means to speak Spanish and be forced to speak Spanish rather than English, correct? Tourism in the Yucatan presents a complex dynamic for language. On one hand, Maya culture is commodified for tourist consumption, with ancient sites, ceremonies, and selective cultural elements packaged for visitors. Yet, this rarely translates into meaningful support for living language communities. In the Yucatan, tourism developments often displaces Maya communities from traditional lands. This mirrors what Mirano Jimenez describes as the operationalization of free market, activities that produce violence on the land and the bodies of the indigenous peoples. Migration patterns have also influenced language revitalization. Economic necessity drives many Mayan speakers to urban areas or tourist zones where speaking English or Spanish becomes necessary for employment and survival. This creates what linguistics call domain of use, where Maya becomes restricted to home or ceremonial contexts where colonial languages dominate public and professional spaces. Contemporary Maya speakers in the United States are usually found in San Francisco, which is similar to what research is saying, how these urban centers or urban areas are having a big push for Mayan speakers. So really understanding contemporary context of Maya speakers in the United States is very important. On the conversation of revitalization efforts, understanding the challenges that are facing the revitalization of many indigenous languages, specifically Yucatec Maya, there are many explicit ways that language can connect to land rights and environmental stewardship. Robert Lazarus's research on circulating cassettes of ceremony indigenous peer-to-peer networks in the Arnhem land provides a useful framework for understanding similar grassroots narrative media initiatives in Yucatan. Just as Aboriginal communities in Australia have created peer-to-peer networks to share ceremonial knowledge through cassette tapes, Maya communities have developed their own media networks to circulate language materials, traditional stories, and ecological knowledge. Currently, Maya has been taught at UNM through a program that is federally funded that I will not focus on too much, but that is kind of the connection here. How do Maya speakers document and share their indigenous language and have these go beyond the homelands that they're at, but also go throughout the world because there are Maya speakers throughout the world. Also understanding the importance of community-based language programs and immersion schools that the program that UNM has creates, where children learning Maya have the opportunity to go to the land. There has been a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that is embedded in Maya vocabulary and grammar. For example, the Maya language contains specific terms for plants, soil types, and weather patterns that have no direct equivalent in Spanish or English, or feelings for that matter as well. When the language disappears, so does this generational environmental wisdom. Several revitalization programs explicitly link language learning to agricultural practices, teaching Maya students through community gardens where they learn traditional milpa farming techniques along linguistic skills. Drawing from Altamirano's Jimenez's research, we can understand that these language revitalization efforts as a form of indigenous resistance challenge the restrictive logic of capitalism. When Maya people lead language preservation workshops that center ecological knowledge, they are engaging in what Jimenez refers to as the refusal of separation of mind and body, land and body, life and non-life, instead centering the web of relationships that constitutes indigenous life. Digital technology plays an increasingly important role in these efforts. Few apps have been able to provide Yucatec Maya, as apps forget the nuances of language and often make literal and inaccurate meanings. Yet, these digital approaches are most effective when grounded in community-based learning, land-connected practices, rather than abstract learning and removal of person and spirituality. So, to get into an analysis, aligning this with a case study in the complex dynamics of Yucatec Maya language revitalization, centering the phrase "inlakich," often translated to "you are my other me," or I am you, you are me. This phrase became famous in the Chicano movement through Luis Valdez's poem Pensamiento Serpiento, and was further popularized by Chicano scholar Dr. Cintly Rodriguez. The phrase is frequently attributed to ancient Maya philosophy and presented as an expression of Maya cosmology. It's been widely adopted in the Chicano study program and has even been incorporated into educational frameworks such as the Mexican American Studies program in Arizona. During a previous ban on Mexican American Studies under Arizona House Bill 2281 in 2010, Inlakich became a powerful tool of resistance against cultural erasure. However, as Diego Monroy Gonzaya points out in his article, The Myth Behind the Mayan in Inlakich, the popular understanding of the phrase contains significant historical inaccuracies. The phrase does not actually appear in ancient Maya texts or traditional ceremonies as commonly claimed. While elements of the concept exist in Maya thought, the specific formulation of its presentation as an ancient Maya greeting or poem presents what intercultural scholars call an inventive tradition, the creation of seemingly ancestral cultural practices just for contemporary or false purposes. This raises complex and almost offensive questions about cultural appropriation, authenticity, and the politics of language revival. On one hand, the adoption of Inlakich in Chicano movements presents a sincere attempt to connect with indigenous heritage and resist colonial erasure. The phrase has become a meaningful way to many people that inspire genuine cultural and educational promises and aspirations. On the other hand, the misattribution of romanticization of Maya culture can inherently reinforce what scholars call imperialistic nostalgia, where colonized cultures are idolized while living indigenous communities and their contemporary struggles remain marginalized. Actual Maya linguists and cultural authorities have had limited voice in their language and philosophy, which are represented now in broader movements in the United States. As Altamirano Jimenez argues, indigenous knowledge should not be separated from the web of relationships, that its meaning and the relationship to other specific territories and communities, Maya linguistic elements are extracted from the land-based context, and they risk what she call another form of resource extractions. Through the lens of critical cultural theory, we can understand Yucatec Maya revitalization as resistance. Applying Gloria Anzaldua's concept of linguistic terrorism, we can see how Maya speakers reclaim their language as an act of resistance against historical trauma and ongoing discrimination. Hi, puta. In her work on linguistic borderlands, Anzaldúa argues that language reclamation is an integral part to healing colonial wounds. The Inca-Lech problem can be understood as when understanding cultural meanings are reproduced, consumed, and practiced because of injustices of power imbalances. It can also create a monolithic view of indigenous cultures that limit their diversity and complexity, overall their sovereignty. Altamirano Jimenez's framework on indigenous refusal promotes a powerful lens for understanding authentic Maya language revitalization efforts. Just as indigenous women in Oaxaca refuse the violence of extractive industries through collective action, Maya speakers refuse linguistic assimilation through daily practices that center their language and its connection to the land. So much so, Mayathan speakers are teaching students from across the nation who are first introduced to Maya because of Inlakich. The refusal challenges colonial logic that separates language, body, and territory and rebuilds language-land connections. The complicated factor here is learning a language away from the land it belongs to. Learning from a Yucatecos have been transformational experience, but I know that being on the physical homeland of the Maya would help the immersive and spiritual aspect of language learning. The revitalization of Yucatec Maya represents more than linguistic preservation and embodies resistance to colonial legacies, reclamation of cultural identity, and reassertion of connections to ancestral lands. As we've explored throughout this podcast, language and land are not inseparable. In Maya worldviews, the world in Lakech does not exist and is closer to relative than you or my other me, the less spiritual and cosmic meaning. However, the history of in Lakech is complicated, just as indigenous language revitalization is. The critical tension that in Lakech has created is a difference that has been well-intentioned to create cultural bartering as authentic rather than leading community reclamation. In summary, I hope to express that as Chicanos and other displaced people, we must be cautious about romanticizing and misrepresenting indigenous communities even when our intentions are to honor them. True respect requires engaging with indigenous communities and knowledge on their own terms, recognizing their living presence rather than treating them as relics of the past. Returning one last time to the framework, Maya language authenticity offers representation to indigenous communities and allows refusal of colonial logic to separate human from nature, mind from body, and language from land. Connecting just like we Red Nation had said, language, land, values allow for linguistic and cultural expressions on the land of ancestors which hold generational knowledges. The community-based networks that supported Maya language revitalization has allowed for many speakers to gain a sense of cultural community that would not allow to happen if not for indigenous language revitalization. In conclusion, I invite listeners to reflect on how our communication practices might either reinforce or challenge colonial language hierarchies and how we might better support indigenous language revitalization worldwide. Ganata Bae.